Thank you so much, Dr. Roger Hayden, for having me here. Thank you to the department, as well as Ohio University, and the graduate students who I've had a wonderful time meeting today, and everybody else who has been able to attend today. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really enjoying my time at Athens, Ohio. This is my first time being in this part of town, so I'm very excited and honored also to have been selected to receive this prize for scholarship in public memory. Ñusta Carranza again, that's my name. I'm an assistant professor of global affairs and human security at the University of Baltimore. But my previous institution where I began my tenure track career was at Ohio Northern University, which is a small school in northwest Ohio, I believe, specifically in terms of the geographic location. Today I'm going to be speaking about South Korea's collective memory of past human rights abuses. I have a residual cough, unfortunately, from a cold. I have tested negative, so I will be resorting to drinking water at times, so I hope you understand that that is just a consequence of having a toddler who goes to daycare. Thank you. So just to provide you a little bit of a context as to what it is that I will be talking about today, I wanted to provide you a little bit about the context of South Korea, and then engage in some level of theoretical discussions in terms of norms, transitional justice, and then engage in the results and provide my final comments. As I was thinking about preparing for today's lecture, one of the things that occurred to me most was the fact that maybe my research and what I've done in this particular publication has resonance and meaning for the broader global context, and it's not only a country-specific case that we have to be thinking about. So, I guess thinking out loud, maybe we can make the connections to what is happening in Florida. Maybe we can also make the connections to what is actually happening in North Korea in terms of curriculum and what students are actually taught, socialist curriculum. So there are many implications I think you can also draw from this single country case study, which is the reason why I think there is a little bit more of a merit to the story. I always tell my students and I always tell my colleagues that the best research begins from a personal story. So this is a personal story. In terms of how, well, I guess I have to start talking about my positionality first. So I am a scholar, I'm a mother, I'm a woman, and I happen to also be of South Korean descent and also of indigenous Peruvian descent, primarily the Quechua-speaking peoples of the northern Andes. So I am a representation of many different cultures. And I grew up, or I spent a lot of my formative years in South Korea. During the 80s, when the democratization movements were occurring, I was there. I also spent a part of my childhood traveling back and forth into Peru. So if you want my Peruvian side of the story, I do have stories about terrorism as well, because we also had terrorist activities in Peru from 1980s to 2000, so I can talk about that as well. But I think in terms of the relevance for Korea, I'll focus on that for now, for the presentation. I studied at a Korean elementary school for a little bit, and then I went with my mother, who was a professor at the time at a Korean university, to Oregon. So I was in Oregon, and that's the first time that I actually learned English. So this is a foreign language for me. In fact, it's my third language. So I have a tendency at times to have an accent, so I hope you understand. And this was a language that I learned in 4th grade, and when I came back, I went to an American school. So where am I going with this? At the American school, I met a girl. At the time, I didn't know what her family background had been, but later on I had, through connections, through friends, I realized that she was actually affiliated with one of the dictators of South Korean history. So then this became a personal story in the sense that I got to also meet her grandpa, who was the older brother of the dictator, who had also been involved in many different human rights abuses. So it became personal that way. It also became personal because I got to see these people. So these people were the people that I would run into very often, times when I would get picked up at kindergarten by my mother. So my parents were both academics, and we lived right behind my father's university, or the university where he was teaching. And oftentimes we would run into these people. At that time, I didn't know what they were. They were looking like this. They looked like they were wearing little funny hats for me at that time. I was like, what is that black hat? And they always had these gray little shields. Later on, when I started learning, I understood that they were riot police. At the time, I had no idea. My father's university was located next to a different university, so there was Foreign Studies next to Kyunghee University at the time, and the foreign faculty lived behind those universities. And the reason why I was able to see them all the time, along with my sister who was in kindergarten with me, was because there were democratization protests happening during the 80s in Korea. And so numerous students from both universities were involved in democratization protests that were going on. And so I would run into these people, and I would be really upset at times because I wanted to go home and have a snack. And they were just preventing me from being able to go home, along with my mother and then my sister who was accompanying us. There was this one time that my mother still tells me to this day that she actually feared for our lives. We were going home, and there was this barricade of these gentlemen, right? The riot police were standing. And apparently I had told one of the riot police, I'm so sick of this, something along those lines. I was a little kid, but I had made that comment, and she said she was really in fear that something would happen to us. And then we would come home. Unfortunately, nothing happened, but she said she feared for our lives. And I remember from this period also the smell of tear gas. I didn't know what that was at that time, and I didn't know why my mother would ask us to wet a lot of cloth or rags and towels around the house, and we would put it all across our steel doors and then our windows. And it was to prevent the smell of tear gas from coming into the household. So that's the time period that I grew up in. So now that I've actually become older and as a scholar of doing work on human rights, these moments have become important for me to reflect upon and to think about how I have this personal connection to this period, and at the same time to think about the fact that, wow, I was really there at that time. This gentleman was the dictator to whom that friend that I had met in middle school and high school had been related to. His name is President Chun Doo-hwan. I think I would like to officially call him General Chun Doo-hwan because he was a general of the armed forces. He was the one responsible for one of the, I would say, the most emblematic and important massacres that took place in Korean history, which is the Gwangju Massacre, also referred to as the Gwangju Democratization Movement that took place in 1980 in May. So this is how it started as a personal story. So to provide you a little bit with a theory, and this is a question that I think, Patala, you asked this question when we were discussing matters regarding reparations and other things, and so how this is connected to the research that I've done. Yes, it is true that I've framed a lot of my research on the basis of transitional justice, which are characterized by retrospective legal responses to confront wrongdoings of repressive predecessor regimes. Generally, they are characterized by truth-seeking policies in the form of truth and reconciliation commissions or truth commissions, or accountability in the sense of criminal accountability, which gets translated into prosecutions. Generally, the accountability that states like to focus upon when analysis comes around its heads of state. So we're looking at presidents or leaders of countries, reparations policies, and legislative changes. Within here, I'm making the connection basically between truth-seeking and reparations together. So what am I trying to look at? Primarily within reparations, we have medical, symbolic, and also financial reparations. I think oftentimes we think about more of the financial side of matters, but what I'm actually trying to focus on is the symbolic side of the reparations. So within symbolic reparations, and again, this also depends on the type of definition that you get, but de Greve, Pablo de Greve was probably the person that's most known for his research on reparations. He defines symbolic reparations as encompassing apologies. These are state-level apologies, creation of museums and parks, days of commemoration, and by the way, creation of museums and parks also includes spaces of memory or places of memory. We have talked about that for a long time with one of the graduate students today. And days of commemoration, so designating a particular day to commemorate a particular human rights event or a massacre or a crime. And last but not least, history rectification. And the way that history rectification can be communicated is by looking at history textbooks and history and how that is changed or communicated in terms of text. So within a more broader spectrum, for those of you interested in like international relations type of theory, and that's the type of actually work that I've done previously as well, is I'm basically examining the post-transitional justice behavior of states. So there's a bulk of literature within international relations, social constructivism in part, I guess, that examines how international human rights norms translate to the domestic level and how they're able to influence in terms of policy outcomes. And And oftentimes they would say that when the state has reached the level of actually going back to addressing past atrocities, you're kind of coming into this notion of norm compliance, where you are complying with the norms that you have already adopted by even examining past crimes. So it's seen as a very heraldic moment, if you will, a critical juncture that you can indicate that there's been a lot of progress that has actually been made. What I'm looking at is what happens after. And so maybe looking at after is already a very much of a critical eye, because I'm questioning, like, is that it? Like, just a policy, like norms as policies, is that it? But I'm actually questioning more than that. I'm like critically looking at whether or not that actually translates into something meaningful, and if there isn't compliance that happens after the policy implementation of these international norms, then basically I'm indirectly critiquing the premise of the original constructivist notion of international human rights norms, to say that at the end of the day, states will always prioritize political interests to that of international human rights norms and ethics and morals. I know that's a controversial statement, but at the same time, I think it's also important to acknowledge the reality. So that's the reason why I call a lot of these transitional justice policies as zombie policies. They exist. You can see them, but they're not fully dead, but they're not fully undead. So they're kind of in that weird little trajectory of continuing to, I guess, maybe take a lot of like budgets so that they can provide reparations, but in reality, in terms of what they actually do substantially, that part is missing. And so I consider that to be zombie policy. So that is the theoretical framing of the broader lens of this particular research and the other research that I've also been doing. So it is from this very critical outlook, I was talking to another professor earlier, how the best way to go about doing things, actually I think it was with graduate students, that you should criticize everything. And that way you can avoid a lot of criticism coming towards you, because you have done the work of criticizing everything you're doing. So that's what I'm doing. So just to give you a little bit more context in terms of the transitional justice mechanisms in Korea, Korea has been really superfluous in terms of having the number of truth commissions that far exceeds most countries. And it is revolutionary and innovative in that what they have done. Oftentimes when we think about transitional justice literature, there isn't such a strong emphasis on looking at East Asian countries, even though there are two countries in particular in East Asia that have engaged in transitional justice policies, including South Korea and Taiwan. So Taiwan is another case that has been very much heavily engaged in truth-seeking, even though it's in most recent years. I think there's still merit to also examine Taiwan in case that is of interest to you. Oftentimes when we think of transitional justice, we think of, and truth-seeking, we think of the South African model, TRC. We also think about a lot of the cases that have been developing in Latin America as well. In addition to prosecutions, we also think about the Latin American cases, talk about Chile, we also talk about Peru, so I guess there's some merit to that. Peru was the first country in the world to to hold a democratically elected head of state accountable for his past crimes. And that was a historic moment. So I guess I gave myself a little bit of a moment of a Peruvianness. I'm feeling proud about the accomplishments that Peru has actually done. I mentioned that. Last but not least, reparations. So in the case of Korea, 11 to 14 different truth commissions. 1996, we had a prosecution. 2 heads of states were convicted, not necessarily on human rights grounds. Originally, they were brought to trial on human rights grounds, but that was dropped, and in the end, they were convicted for treason. So it was a little bit of a different nature, but nonetheless, if you want to look at the symbolism of what that actually what the trial holds for the victims and victims' families, maybe there is merit to that, except that a year later, they were offered a presidential pardon and let go. So that's the part that I always examine, what happens after. And you know, that the after actually matters. Reparations were associated with each of these commissions, and the list of commissions is vast. So to give you a little bit more of a context about Korean history, we had the Japanese colonization period from 1910 to 1945. And then we had the American occupation period from 1945 to 48. We had the Korean War to 1950 to 53. We had a brief moment of a President Lee Seung-man period of 1948 to 1950. He was our first president. And then later on, we have the era of authoritarian governments, which predates the Korean War period from 48 all the way till 89. So if you think about it, South Korea has not been, I guess, a full-fledged democracy for a long time. And if you want to think about this, like, according to Samuel Huntington's 3 waves of democratization terms, we fell into the 3rd wave of democratization period, which was kind of similar, if you will, to the trajectory of many different Latin American states that were also going through a democratic transition period that came much later. One thing that I want to emphasize is that we've had the Japanese colonial period. That was from 1910 to 1945. And there's a reason why I want to emphasize this, and this is perhaps related to the broader conversations that are going on in American academia about reparations and truth-seeking as well. So in the USA Transitional Justice Talk series that were taking place last year, one of the conversations that came up had to do with historic crimes, how the period of enslavement within the American context was so long ago that it was going to be difficult to engage in meaningful truth-seeking among other matters. Now, one thing I can tell you is I have spoken with many truth commissioners that have worked on Korea's, for instance, this one, suspicious death, and the Presidential Truth Commission on Military Suspicious Deaths. This is actually related to the Korean War period, who have told me very bluntly that a lot of the victims are dead. A lot of the people are dead. So it's really hard to identify and interview people because they are dead. But nonetheless, it doesn't mean that just time has passed, that there isn't merit and importance to actually uncovering the truth, finding out what actually happened through archival evidence, and establishing these facts. And that was one of the reasons why they continued on their work. And I think in that, if we try to think about the fact that Korea was able to examine that long of a period ago history, even including the Japanese colonization period, again, 1910 to 1945, I think there is merit, perhaps, to that kind of conversation about historic crimes also happening in this country as well regarding the period of enslavement. So perhaps that's something to think about, think out loud, and maybe there is some merit to also thinking about that in different ways. There's also been a group of scholars who have been looking at historical reparations for historical crimes, primarily related to Latin America. So we're looking at going back into the Spanish arrival period in the Latin Americas, and their friction and engagement that they originally had with indigenous populations, and reparations regarding that period, or looking at that period and trying to provide some level of reflection of the truth and reparative justice. So there are certain types of conversations that are also emerging in the field about historical crimes and what has actually happened. Among the various truth commissions that are listed here, I'm focusing on this one, which is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or the TRCK. So why am I focusing on that? Because that's the one that was also considered to be the all-encompassing commission. So that was the one that was tasked to investigate all these other crimes. So this is kind of like, I guess, the Bible when it comes to everything and anything else that had actually happened in terms of the previous commissions. What is interesting is that this commission begins its mandate in 2005, finishes it in 2010, but it is relaunched again in 2020. So there was a need that the progressive government of President Moon Jae-in felt that there was a need to reinvestigate a few cases, which is the reason why this commission, the TRCK, was reopened in 2020, and then it finished its work in 2022. So there has been a lot of those types of extensions as well. Now, I wanted to also take a moment to point out these political tendencies. And I think the reason why I wanted to point out these political tendencies is to talk about this person in a little bit, because this person is mentioned in the article, but in particular just to show you the trajectory of the progressive-leaning governments and conservative-leaning governments in South Korean politics. So most of the Truth Commission overtures and Truth Commission initiatives take place during progressive governments. So Kim Dae-jung was a human rights activist. He was a Catholic, and I want to emphasize Catholic human rights activist because this is actually the first time that you see the intervention of the Catholic Church on his behalf when he was arbitrarily detained. So I think that is really important if you want to look at international non-governmental organization or transnational advocacy coming into picture. It was with Kim Dae-jung when he was a human rights activist. Then we have Roh Moo-hyun, who was a progressive-leaning president. He was a human rights lawyer before he became president. So that obviously obviously had a huge impact in terms of the development of numerous truth commissions that began after his mandate. Then you have the conservative-leaning governments coming into power, and clearly you see a gap year here, about 14 years of nothing happening. And in particular, I want to emphasize this person named Park Geun-hye, who is the daughter of the dictator or President Park Chung-hee that we had in South Korea, who was responsible for numerous human rights violations. As you can clearly see, she didn't fulfill the 5-year mandate, and I mean, this is, we had a brief discussion with the graduate student regarding populism and grassroots protests. This was covered in the news all over the world, where there was a huge movement within the Korean citizenry to go out, and they called it the candlelight protest, and they eventually ousted her from power. But she was the daughter of President Park Chung-hee, and it was during her time that the national history textbook is compiled together, which is the reason why I wanted to take a moment to mention that, because it was during her period that the national history textbook was compiled. There was, at the very beginning, I would say, a blind level of criticism thrown against the history textbook because of the fact that it was probably, most people were looking at her and saying it's going to have to do with the people. So she's probably going to omit things or pressure that the textbook writers to omit things that would be unfavorable to her father's legacy. And the last but not least, we have Moon Jae-in coming into power, and then I didn't list the current government, which is also conservative. So looking directly into South Korea and South Korea's TRCK recommendations, they specifically recommended the rectification of history and the reproduction of memory. So they issued 2 reports. In 2006, the report that they issued, and also in the 2010 final report. Originally in the 2006 report, they noted that they asked the state to rectify the honor of the victims and institute political and legal mechanisms for social reconciliation. In the 2010 final report, and I here bolded this section, they asked the state basically to engage in reparative justice techniques and mechanisms by instituting peace and security education and cultivating education on the basis of historical consciousness. So the TRCK's recommendations on history rectification represented the basis for an educational revision to help society grasp and understand current history from past events. In the words of Cole, educational institutions and textbooks are an important vehicle that carry the work of transitional justice beyond the original period of their activity. And I think it's also important to remember that we don't think of transitional justice policies as sedentary policies that finish at the moment that they're done with their mandate, but they are continuous in the sense of the impact that they can actually have on society and the generations to come. In that, I think education and history textbooks serve even a greater purpose. So the article and the study is about the mnemonic representation of the past for transitioning states. The collective representation of the past is a set of public discourses about the past as wholes, or narratives and images of the past that speak in the name of collectivities. This article contributes to the literature on the politics of memory, production in East Asia, and transitional justice by examining the relationship between memory, symbolic reparations, and truth commission narratives. History revisions produced in textbooks complement truth-telling, deepen official acknowledgement of atrocities, are a central venue for the construction of memories, and have been used to further the impact of transitional justice processes. And I would not actually stop there. In my engagement and discussion with students today, we were talking aloud and thinking about the possibilities of textbooks, memory construction, collective memory, as perhaps also being related or having links to the notion of national identity, construction of nationhood, construction of the nation state, which are ideas linked with Benedict Anderson and Eric Hobsbawm, notions of social engineering and how a common nationhood is born. So in that, I think there is a lot of merit in terms of thinking about collective memory, the construction of memory, and why that is particularly important for a nation state and for a national identity to form. This is the way in which the South Korean textbook system was developed. So we had a state-sponsored and a state-authorized publication system. So I would love to hear at some point about the comparisons of how textbook production actually gets made in the U.S. I would say I do not know very well. So I would love to bounce ideas and learn that as well. So in 2007, the South Korean National Curriculum Reform, the publishing shifted from a state-sponsored to a state-authorized production. So private publishers were not publishing following state guidelines. And in 2009, we had the reform with the new learning outcomes that even included a push for a correct vision of history. This was seen as maybe the comeback of the state, but in reality, because private publishers were still publishing the textbooks, it was not necessarily seen as an intrusive moment of the state. However, in 2016, the influence of the state seemed to make a comeback with the National History textbook commissioned by President Park Geun-hye, and the whole discussion about memory production involving the state and what is correct history, the rectification of history, came back into the picture. So I got a hold of it. So one of the things that I had mentioned to the graduate students that I find sometimes troubling as a researcher is that at times we tend to blindly criticize matters even without knowing the facts. I had read up to this point a lot of criticism about the history textbook, but I don't believe many of the scholars actually had access. The history textbooks, these were samples that were distributed to reporters. So journalists did have copies, so they could actually write the articles that they did. But not every scholar actually had access to them, and yet they were already criticizing the textbook. That's not doing social science, right? That's not being empirically correct. So what I did was I got a copy of the book. I contacted a professor I knew. He knew a reporter friend. And through interesting channels, I was able to acquire the book. And then I went about doing my analysis the right way that we should all be doing. So I looked into it and found an interesting set of matters. Now, the expected outcome originally with this textbook was that even with the conservative government that at least just adhering to the theory and notions of the fact that states that come to even accept or implement transitional justice norms as policies would probably be in favor of complying with the TRCK truth narrative, that was the expected outcome, was not necessarily true. In fact, what actually ended up happening was that politics conditions human rights behavior, and politics conditions ultimately what the outcome was with this text. I do want to point out that this textbook was rejected, so this is, that is like not a part of history anymore, not a part of the curriculum, but yet there was merit to examining this because this showed the extent to which the state could have had the reach to influence generation of peoples. And in that, it's a little bit scary and at the same time daunting to think that this could have been the result. But was it really that bad? So let me go into greater depth, and this is probably nitpicked information, so if this goes over your head, that's okay. The textbook describes General Park Chung-hee, the particular dictator that I mentioned, era under Chapter 7, Section 2 as the authoritarian governance structure during the Cold War period and the socioeconomic progress in South Korea. So in that, the acknowledgement of the authoritarian government, okay, that's great, check. But they also noted the socioeconomic progress, okay? So kind of a balanced picture being provided. A positive outlook is provided about the economic development the chapter reveals, but Chapter 7 does not refer to human rights violations from 1961, so selective omission starting. According to the TRCK, Park was responsible for the arbitrary detention and ill treatment of 7 civilians during the May 16, 1961 military coup d'etat that brought Park to power. The civilians were arrested arbitrarily, and 10 of the 17 individuals were convicted without due process. The findings of the TRCK determined that such acts were in violation of the Constitution and basic human rights. The history textbook also admitted other human rights violations noted in the TRCK's report. One of the cases was the People's Revolutionary Party's incident of July 1964 that followed up a previous incident brought up to the Committee on Korean Central Intelligence, which found the state responsible for the arbitrary detention of individuals suspected of belonging to the People's Revolutionary Party. For this case, which primarily dealt with Park's government opposing leftist political parties, mind you, this is the Cold War period, the TRCK recommended a new hearing and found the state responsible for arbitrary detention. Given the textbook committee's conservative political leanings critical of social movements that disturb the political stability of the state, it is likely that such cases of human rights violations were selectively excluded from the text. The human rights violations that are acknowledged by the textbook in fact center upon state crimes related to the passage, adoption, and implementation of the 1972 Yushin Constitution. This was a very notorious constitution at the time. In fact, it was called neo-fascist by some scholars. The textbook describes this period as one that experienced the entry of the Yushin Constitution and the trial of democracy in South Korea. And basically, the Constitution expanded the power of the executive branch to third term, and not only that, they could dismiss officials, cabinet officials at any time, including 1/3 of the National Assembly members. Scholars, as I noted before, characterize the Yushin Constitution as a document that formed the basis of a neo-colonial fascism, which was designed to suppress the people's demand that the ruling classes of imperialism cease to resist liberal democratic reform. So the textbook does refer to some of the oppressive qualities of the Yushin Constitution and criticizes Park's authoritarian governance. And they do include some information about the emergency decrees that were enacted at that time as well, in addition to the responses from the public regarding the repressive policies. However, there was still lots of political context information of the crimes, and some of the human rights crimes that were mentioned in TRCK were missing. On Gwangju, which is one of the most important democratic movements, and actually the massacre that actually took place, those were included in the National History textbook. However, details of the various human rights crimes investigated by the TRCK and why the Gwangju democratization movement was pivotal for democracy was absent in the narrative. So without setting the memory based on the TRCK's historical truth and contextualizing the massacre within the political history of economic marginalization of Gwangju citizens and the province of Jeolla during General Park's period, it was difficult for the average person to understand why the people of Gwangju led the democratization movement in the first place. So you need the context to be able to understand what was actually happening. On Gwangju a little bit more, the developments surrounding what took place in Gwangju are labeled as the May 18th democratization movement. So the word massacre is missing. Textbook details how after the troops enforcing martial law closed Congress and detained thousands of students and politicians on May 17, 1980, a series of anti-government protests spread throughout the country. In Gwangju, the pro-democracy and anti-government protests were led by university students, and I always find this very interesting how university students are the most peacefully and active as well, because they believe in change, right? I guess when you get older, you become a little more cynical. Whose peaceful efforts were violently crushed by military troops. The textbook describes the government's response as overdone. That's a very simple word that probably doesn't convey a lot of information. And how until the 27th of May, the military murdered and injured a vast number of civilians. Pictures of Kumnam Road in Gwangju province provide a visual to the democracy movement, and there is mention of the importance of the May 18th movement for South Korea and Asia's democratization processes. However, there is no further elaboration on the specific cases of human rights violations related to Gwangju. None of the cases from the TRCK's reports are mentioned, and no guidelines for discussions on the Gwangju movement are also provided. And Gwangju, I don't know if you know this case very well, but this is a classic case where there was a lot of use of torture, including insects being also used for torture. Clubbing. In other words, it was a massacre, and it was so uncontrolled to the extent that the armed forces that were on the ground would even kill their own people by mistake because there was such an unleashing of killings. Later on, also documents have also proven the fact that helicopters were also involved. The American government, by the way, was aware that this was happening on the ground. And this was during Jimmy Carter's period. So, question mark there. In contrast to the Gwangju massacre, interestingly, the textbook puts more emphasis on the June 1987 democratization movement and its role for Korea's democratic transition. Don't get me wrong, this was a very important also human rights movement that occurred in Korea. However, there was Gwangju. That's why there was the June democratization protest. The textbook explains the reason why people rose against the state in June and how the torture of university student Park Jong-chul served as a catalyst to motivate the protest. The elaboration of such developments are absent on Gwangju is comparative to the ample discussion of the events leading up to the June movement. In addition, the textbook belabors on the torture and murder of Park, which is referenced both in the textbook and in the TRC case report. So great, great. The textbook states that police forces tortured Park, which led to his death in 1987. Moreover, they even engaged in discussions about Lee Han-yeon's death, who was basically killed by a tear gas canister, which increased the public's demand for democracy. So there's more coverage on the June 1987, less on Gwangju, and some coverage of Park's human rights violations. So partial picture, if you will, in terms of what has actually happened. So what does this actually mean? So what the textbook has actually done is emphasize one victimhood more than the other. But why is one victimhood more emphasized more than the other? Then we go back to Park Geun-hye and her tendency of trying to perhaps portray her father's period in a more positive light, and yet at the same time including some level of human rights violation so that it doesn't seem like it was just a beautiful period of economic progress. So in that there was a little bit of a balancing act of one type of selective omissions. Now, as to the reason why Gwangju was not highlighted as much as the June democratization movement, there can be many reflections on that as well, but it may be likely because of Chun Doo-han and his power and his related people's power still in government that has been able to influence a more conservative leaning of what has actually happened in the democratization process and protests that developed during Gwangju and in the post-period as well. Politics has ultimately shaped one type of atrocity more than the other, and that is where you actually see this very interesting element of how politics has been able to condition the type of history that has actually been produced. There's a purposeful emphasis, if you will, of one government over that of others, and their links to human rights violations. These are reflective of possible influences of former government regime elements or sympathizers and their impact on educational reforms. So just because one government has disappeared or moved out of the picture, it doesn't mean that their influences that those governments and their regime holders have in power suddenly dissipate. They continue, and this is actually a pattern that I found not only in the Korean case, but in the comparative regional work that I do. This is the case in Uruguay, this is the case in Peru, and this is the case in Korea. So we have the continuous elements of the remnants of former regime elements having power in conditioning transitional justice policies and its outcomes. So what does this really mean? We have, if you want to think about this in theoretical terms, not full compliance, but not complete non-compliance. And here I do want to emphasize the fact that it's okay to come to this kind of conclusion. Not everything is binary, not everything is black or white. There is a gray zone. Political interests have influenced the outcome of what happened with this textbook. However, it is, I think, wrong to state that the history textbook in particular dealt with in this case represents only one-sided picture of history. In fact, they do provide some level of human rights violations facts, while in other cases they don't. So there's a selective omission, which I think is even more concerning, if you will, in terms of making it look like it's okay, but in reality there's another political agenda that is embedded. So in that, I think there's a lot to think about in terms of political interest. Going back to the compliance picture, not compliance, but not full non-compliance either. Compliance in this context, I was measuring on the basis of whether or not the different types of crimes that were included in the TRC case reports were at least being emphasized or mentioned in the history textbook. Granted, I understand that a history textbook cannot cover every single crime that was mentioned in the TRC case report, which is the reason why I focus on the broader or bigger cases, which is the Gwangju democratization movement, the June democracy movements, and then the crimes related to President or General Park Chung-hee or Dictator Park Chung-hee's period in Korean history. And so that is where I had actually left in terms of my conclusions. And I will leave it at that.